Good day. I'm Ronald Day, your host of Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion driven show where we focus on issues related to the criminal legal system. Today, we have a show on voting and civic engagement for people impacted by the system. My guests include two extraordinary advocates, and I'm so excited to have this conversation with them. So, one is Bonifacio Aleman, a lead organizer at Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, and Dana Vickers Shelley, executive director of the ACLU of Maryland. So today, with us approaching November and the election at the Fortune Society, we feel it's very necessary to have a discussion about voting and civic engagement. And I'll just tell you quickly something about myself, and then I want to bring the guests front to have them introduce themselves and talk about the work that they're doing. So how this issue impacts me is because, as I've mentioned in the past, I served 15 to 45 years in New York State prison. And before my incarceration, I was completely disengaged with the political process. But after becoming socially conscious while I was inside, I said, when I get released, of course, I want to be able to vote and just be involved in civic engagement. So once I was released in 2007, after serving 15 years, I did not have the right to vote. It wasn't until 5 years after serving time on community supervision or in New York State parole that I was able to vote. So that was 2012. So that was my first opportunity voting, 2012. I was already 43 years old at the time. And since then, New York State did in 2021 pass a law that allows people to vote who've been discharged from prisons, whether or not they are on parole or any form of community supervision. So we're proud that as advocates, we push for that law to be changed in New York State. So I want to talk to my colleagues here about work that they're doing in Maryland and in Kentucky to help support the rights of people who've been impacted by the system around voting. So why don't we, have them introduce themselves? So Miss Dana, why don't we start with you as executive director for the ACLU of Maryland, ACLU of Maryland. Love to hear about yourself and the work that you're doing, especially around voting for people who've been impacted by the criminal legal system.
Thank you so much, Ronald. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Dana Vickers Shelley, Executive Director of the ACLU of Maryland, the American Civil Liberties Union. Our focus is on making sure that every person across our state is able to vote. One of the things that we've done in the last few years that's been extremely important and impactful is to work closely with and in fact be led by the expertise of Black women, Latino women who are home from incarceration, who are organizing voting drives and programs to make sure that folks who've come home can register, can vote, and also to make sure that there are opportunities for individuals who are inside pre-trial, pre-conviction, pre-trial in particular, that they can still register as well as vote. In Maryland, that's an option. And we so appreciate that expertise and that partnership that we have with Life After Release, with the Maryland Justice Project, as well as Out for Justice.
Excellent. Thank you for that summary of the work that you're doing, Dana. And Bonifacio, why don't you tell us about some of the work that you're doing in Kentucky?
Thank you, Ronald. It's an honor to be here. So I work for Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, and we've been an organization for 43 years in Kentucky. I head up our Jefferson County team. Among the multitude of issues we work on, one is the restoration of voting rights for folks like myself who've lost the right to vote due to a felony conviction. We've had a coalition here in Kentucky for the past 20 years working on this, governor after governor. I myself served 11 years in prison and still did not have the right to vote. I've been free for 16 years. And most recently, we made it to the U.S. Supreme Court in Aleman versus Bashir, fighting for the restoration of voting rights. Unfortunately, we lost in that battle. I'm also a doctoral student, and the focus of my research is advocacy, activism, and civic engagement after incarceration. So it's definitely an honor to be here and talk about this great topic.
Excellent. And as someone who earned a PhD myself, I'm excited to refer to you in the future as Dr. Aleman. So we know that there are millions of people that have lost the right to vote, but there have been some states that have, based upon laws that have allowed people to have their rights to vote restored. And again, I'm one of those individuals. Right now, only Maine and Vermont allow for people, no matter whether they're incarcerated, not to vote. And some people say that there's a huge kind of racial disparity for people who are unable to vote because of their convictions, because we know that the majority of people who are incarcerated in our country happen to be people of color. So Dana, can you just tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing in the state of Maryland to push for the restoration of the rights of people to vote? You mentioned doing some work pre-trial, and I'm sure you're working with people, as you mentioned, people who are directly impacted by the system, who are in the community. Just tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing.
Thanks so much. Yes, in the state of Maryland, individuals who have completed their parole, completed their confinement, when they return home, they're able to register to vote. They're able to vote. The only offense that is not able to vote after fulfilling the carceral obligation are those who've been convicted of election fraud and election-related crimes. But other matters, individuals come home, they're able to register and vote. And a key part of what we're doing, along with our community partners and being led by our community partners, again, this amazing coalition of African American and Latino women who are moving forward in this, is making sure that individuals who come home, their families, their community leaders, their faith leaders and other organizations are also aware of this. We know how important it is to vote. We know how much information people are often exposed to, and we want to be sure that when people come home, they know that they can register to vote. They have information on how to register and where they can vote, and that their families have access to that information too. We know that representation and voting is central to a community's growth and success. And when people return home to community, we want to be sure that the community is able to thrive. And that's why it's so important for us to work with local organizations, with community partners, with our state boards of election and county boards of election, to make sure that they too have that information, as well as working with some jails and prisons in Maryland to bring in voter registration forms and ballots, so that, again, folks who are pre-trial, who've not been convicted of any crime or offense, can maintain their right to vote, which they still do have.
Excellent. Thank you for providing that information, Dana. Bonifacio, I wanted to ask you a question, because you've been advocating for years now. I think you said you've been home 16 years now, and clearly you've been out there working heavily on this issue. What is the fear of allowing people who have criminal convictions to vote? I mean, what I hear and what it seems like is that politicians think that people who have criminal histories are a monolith. Like, we're going to only vote for one party. For example, everybody who's criminal justice system involved is going to vote for Democrat, for example. And my time in prison definitely did not convince me, because I talked to people who are all over the political spectrum while I was inside and since I've been home. So we're not a monolith. People who have different views and perspectives. But what is the fear about allowing people to vote, so that someone who is coming home from incarceration, as Dana mentioned, should have the right to vote? And if you're incarcerated, you're still a citizen. Why not have the right to vote? I mean, Maine does it, Vermont does it. Right now, the District of Columbia does it, although it's not a state. Just tell the audience, what's the fear that politicians and others have about allowing people with criminal convictions to vote?
Well, thank you for a great question. I think it's one of those political footballs that people play with. We hear, right, kind of what you said. Oh, if people are given the right to vote, they're going to vote criminals in, right?
Mhm.
Last year, we were at the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the attorney for the Kentucky governor, when the justices asked them why they didn't restore people's rights like mine who have applications in, they said that they use this term of not worthy of the right to
Mhm.
vote. And when the
Yeah.
justices asked them what a definition of that was, they couldn't give it. But we hear that when we lobby, because ironically, even though I can't vote in Kentucky, I'm still a registered lobbyist with the state. And so when we talk to lawmakers, that's one of the things, the theme that we hear is this idea, unfounded idea of the need to be worthy of the right to vote. Every year in the General Assembly, there's usually bills filed that to some degree would restore the right to vote. They always vary in terms of what crimes would or would not be excluded from that list, how long people should wait, and usually gets mired down in that, in those details, right? And so it's one of those political footballs. But I think that, and I believe that research shows, right, like Thomas LaBelle and Justin Smith, right, have researched and written extensively about right, a coping, like voting in civic engagement as coping strategies and coping mechanisms against the stigmatization of incarceration, right? Justice Smith talks about the third mile, right, after incarceration, that not only does helping folks in previously similar situations add to, right, the helper, but going this third mile and being civically engaged not only does a great deal for the people who are now being able to vote, but for society at large. Because at the end of the day, uh, a democracy is only as healthy as the participation. And so, if we continue to exclude people, we continue to create an unhealthy democracy. Um,
Thank you for that, Bonifacio. Dane, I want to ask you a question because the ACLU has a long history of providing support to a diverse, set of people who've been disfranchised for multiple things. But right now, many people that we engage with who have been in the system are apathetic about the political process. I think many of them feel like, what's the purpose of voting? Like, what is voting going to do for me? The ACLU works with people. What do you think is kind of the answer to that particular question? Like, how is it that we could help support individuals who are thinking my vote doesn't really matter? Like, why should I even be involved in the political process?
I appreciate that question, and it allows me to connect to a bit of what Bonifacio was just describing. As we know, after African Americans were enslaved, they were still and immediately almost begun to be arrested to have free labor in states. And keeping Black folks and Latino folks, new Americans, not enslaved, but imprisoned, is a way to diminish community power. That is one of the reasons that I believe too many governments and states across this country still resist having Black and Brown and Indigenous and low income folks being able to access the ballot, not wanting to share that power. What we do at the ACLU of Maryland is we share that power with individuals who have firsthand expertise about why people are voting, why people aren't voting. One of the things that was so exciting in a documentary that we created a few years ago was to hear the voices of folks who've returned home, men and women, some older, some younger, who talked about how exciting it was to be able, not just to be able to vote, but to bring their family members with them. One of our community leaders, Monica Cooper, with the Maryland Justice Project, talked about running for one of the local central committees where she could be involved and have a role in not just voting herself, but bringing other people into the process. More Black and Brown Indigenous folks involved in this central process to the American system, to democracy, is what we at the ACLU want to have happen. And the more that we can engage and be in alignment and partnership and learn from those who've been inside and those in communities where there are too many people inside and are now coming home to reclaim their rights, we believe at the ACLU that that's better for our neighborhoods, our communities, our cities, our states, and our country as a whole.
Thank you. I mean, it's very important for organizations to understand the role that people who have been impacted by the system can play in helping to change the system. Bonifacio, as someone who has a case before the Supreme Court, you had a case and you lost the case. I mean, some people would love to get a case in district court, more or less, before the United States Supreme Court. What advice do you have for people who want to do this type of advocacy in other states? I mean, you've made some pretty good progress. Your governor did restore the rights of some individuals to vote. I think it was around 140,000 or so who had their rights restored. What advice do you have for folks? I mean, Kentucky is typically known as a pretty conservative state, but I mean, you have a Democratic governor in place, and people are all over the country, you know, Democratic places, there are issues with voting, you know, in some places it doesn't really matter. So just curious about what you can offer in that particular space around suggestions for people who want to do work around civic engagement and voting rights restoration.
A couple of things, actually, Ronald, right? Because Kentucky is like one of the worst 3 states for voting rights restoration, even in light of the governor's executive order in 2019. But some practical advice I would give people is, one, to center the voices of the directly impacted people, right? Those of us who have lived that experience, who have had to go through the process of attempting to get our right to vote back, but center those voices, right? Michelle Alexander did it, as our dear colleague just mentioned, right? A good job of painting that picture, right? From slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. And so always keep that in mind, but also in addition to that, to be emotionally protected and stable. It's emotionally trying work. At the same time, the governor of Kentucky, right, was arguing against, right, us in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court. My job also has a PAC, and the PAC endorsed Bashir for his reelection. And so, at the same time, I was fighting for the right to vote. I also was leading a team of people to work on reelecting the governor, and it's emotionally trying work. Sometimes it's in for the long haul. That lawsuit we were on, that lawsuit went on for about 8 years through multiple governors. And so it can take time, but I think my biggest advice is for people to be persistent, and to center those voices of directly impacted people. We know that, right, people civically engage in, and that there are ways to civically engage in addition to the ballot box, right? We talk a lot about that in our coalition here in Kentucky for folks like myself who can't vote, and what we can do, right? And we can still flex our collective power through lobbying, through, right, all the different forms of public forums. I think there's this idea that I believe in, right, that we can speak truth to power in light of that, and that our persistence will carry us through.
Yeah, thank you, Bonifacio. And Dana, you're in Maryland. Maryland is what, more of a Democratic state? You had a Republican governor recently. You have a Democratic governor now, Wes Moore. And as I said a minute ago, I don't know that it's just politics. I think it's what you said earlier, which is that history of depriving people of the right to vote, having mostly to do with someone's racial and sometimes even ethnic and economic background. But besides voting, Bonifacio also talked about civic engagement. What ideas do you think, Dana, someone who is formerly incarcerated or directly impacted could do to exercise civic engagement, even if they don't necessarily have the right to vote?
I love that question. I feel like I was born a voting rights advocate. And so this opportunity Being a part of the ACLU gives me a chance to lean into that every day. There are so many ways to be involved in civic engagement, whether it's through a local organization, a faith institution, a group of neighbors who make a decision to check in on the local senior citizen home, the nursing home, and make sure that the individuals who live there have their voter registration that are current, that they are registered so they know in their new location in the nursing home where they can vote, to talk to young people who are in colleges and universities, make sure that they are registered in the state where they go to college. If their address is there, they should be registered there, they can vote there. To reach out to people within their network. If there are pre-release centers, for example, in the states or communities where people are returning home, to talk with individuals there, with coworkers, with small groups. A couple of years ago, I worked with people who were going to barbershops and beauty shops to have conversations and hand out flyers about registering to vote, where people could vote. It's so important to go where people are. We know in Maryland that although only 30% of our population is African American, 70% of the population in our jails and prisons is Black. We know, again, this is related to power. And so it's so important for individuals in community, returning citizens, to continue to be a part of their community, where their families are living, where their chosen family, where their friends are living, and talk with people about why this is so important, share their personal experience. If I'd had the chance to vote, or now that I have the opportunity to vote, here's the difference I believe that I can make. I want you to support me and my efforts in doing that as well.
Thank you, Dana. I want to go back into the facilities because I mentioned, or in the only two states that allow people who are incarcerated to vote. Bonifacio, what are your thoughts there? Will there ever be a time, and maybe not in our lifetime, but in America, where even if you've been convicted of a crime and you're incarcerated, that you might actually still have a right to vote if you are a citizen?
I think that's a good question. Earlier in this General Assembly, back in January, February, March, we saw one Kentucky lawmaker file a bill that essentially, if that were passed, it didn't, but that would have created or earmarked in the Kentucky Constitution where people didn't lose the right to vote, period. And like you said, I don't know if we'll see that in our lifetime, but I have hope that we will. My 6-year-old said to me a few weeks ago, she was like, "Dad, when I become president, I'm going to make sure you and everybody else can always vote because I believe in the power of the vote." And so I have hope that even if it's not in our generation or our lifetime, Ronald, that we'll get there.
Is there any way to transfer the thinking of your 6-year-old to some of the political officials that we have? Frankly, Dana, what about you? That question is, again, maybe not in our lifetime, but you've been doing this work for some time, and is it possible ever that people are going to have the right to vote even if they've, made a bad decision and ended up incarcerated and convicted in a state, no matter that it's not a state that's like Maine or Vermont that's mostly white?
I am definitely hopeful, and only hopeful that Bonifacio's future president and his family has the opportunity to make that pronouncement all across the country. But while we're waiting for her, I think that more and more places, people are understanding that there's not a connection between a bad decision in someone's life 5 or 10 or 25 years ago and their rights and ability to participate in democracy. Again, in Maryland, everyone who returns home can do that, but how great would it be if our communities would not be afraid of the power and influence and involvement of Black and Brown Indigenous folks, of working class folks who perhaps made a decision, are inside, to participate in the process? How else to continue to have our communities grow and be strong than to have every single person being able to make a contribution to that? And voting is such a powerful, long-lasting way to do that. I hope it is in my lifetime where that would be able to happen. And we're working to make sure so many of us across the country, across the state of Maryland, people with the ACLU, people with so many organizations such as both of yours that are working to make that happen. And I hope to see that day when everyone, every citizen has the right to vote.
Thank you, Dana. That's very powerful. Bonifacio, you have like 20 seconds. Do you want to just kind of like end with some closing remarks?
Yeah, so I spoke at a rally earlier this year, and one of the things that we talked about and I felt was so impactful is, just as our colleague just said, everybody deserves the right to vote. And in an ideal democracy, we should not be taking the right to vote from people as a form of punishment. So I hope people hear that, people rally behind that, and that we collectively never give up.
So I want to say thank you to Dana Shelly for joining us today from the ACLU, and to Bonifacio Aleman from Kentucky. I mean, this was an extraordinary conversation about restoration of voting rights for people who've been impacted by the system, as well as civic engagement. So thanks to both of you for being on this show, and we're excited to talk about this issue and to continue to discuss it as we approach election season.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Please, go to Fortune Society's website, and also you'll be able to see this episode on our YouTube channel. And we're just excited for you to see this. And by all means, engage with us and with our guests around this particular issue of voting and civic engagement for people who've been impacted by the criminal legal system.